All right. So this talk is about building a modern security team. And really what this is this talk is the talk that I wish I could have given myself 3.5 years ago when I started at Etsy and started building the team there. And it's really like learn from my pain, right? Like everything in here probably has some sort of subtle mistake that I learned from behind it or things like that. So that's kind of the hope of sharing this. And then, yeah, like I said, recently helped co-found Signal Sciences. That's not what this is about at all, actually. So this is really around the lessons learned in building and really adapting a team. And I think it's the adapting part that's really interesting to a lot of folks, really across organizations. So I think that the world has really changed for 3 fundamental ways for the way in which we've approached security over the last decade, 15 years or so. And the first is the shift to continuous deployment or instantaneous deployment. And really that shift is so fundamental in the way that we've thought about application security, because we've really, and I'll go into all of this in a minute, but we've really approached security as a gating function and a blocking function in long development cycles. So you have, waterfall, and maybe your development cycle is 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. And somewhere along the way, security is a gate in that. And that's not the way in which things actually operate anymore and the way in which that we're going to. The other is kind of you get to watch me dance around not saying DevOps in a bullet right here. This is development and operations. So I didn't do that good of a job. It really means, especially in startups, it means more people with access to production. Right now you have the superset of operations and a lot of development as well now has access there. So how do we think about that from security? And then from the offensive side, the cost of attack has really gone to not quite zero, but has significantly dropped. And what I mean out of that are really the proliferation of both tooling, techniques, and the attack base just increasing. So this is kind of the agenda for the talk. I'm really going to talk through how do you think about security in continuous deployment, how do you think about security in DevOps and a world where more people have access, and then finally, how do we use cost of attack not just as a scary bullet point, but actually as a thing which is a feedback loop into our security programs, in which we really start to drive good change and make use of that. So first, what do I mean when I say near instantaneous deployment? I've got a highly technical chart from how deployment used to happen, which was you would take the bits and you would shovel them onto the bit cart, and it would go down the Oregon Trail, and if no one got cholera and forded a river just fine, they would make it to production in about 12 to 18 months. And then you'd repeat this all over again, and an axle would break, and then you'd have an out-of-band batch, and everything like that would be fun. What is this shifting to? So I use Etsy as a case study here, but really replace Etsy in any of this with really any, not just technical organization, but with a lot of organizations. So Etsy as a case study deploys to production about 30 times a day on average. Now this isn't 30 pieces of code that go to production. This is 30 deployments to production. So each deployment probably contains anywhere from like 5 to 8 different change sets. And you do, the shift here is really that a lot of what we used to do in development and much earlier stages, you now actually do live in production. And so the 3 kind of buckets that falls into are feature flags, ramp ups, and A/B testing. Everyone calls feature flags something slightly different, and same with ramp ups. A/B testing is a pretty standard term now. So what I mean by that is, and what I mean by really iteration in production is, let's say you've got some feature that you're working on. And the first thing that you do for that feature is basically write a giant if statement that says, if this is turned on, if this feature flag is turned on, then execute all the code in between here. And then what you do is you push that out there into production, and then you start checking in code in between that if statement. And you're actually pushing that code live into prod. And you're testing it on your development VMs, your development environment and stuff like that beforehand, but you're actually pushing that live into prod because it's not executing in prod. Then once you get to a point where you're like, okay, the super early version of this feature is kind of ready, I've done a bunch of testing locally and everything like that, now it's time to start what's called a ramp up. And so what you're doing then is you're saying, okay, it turns out that if statement actually isn't a binary if statement of on or off. What it actually is, okay, is this enabled or not? And now for enabled, you can say, okay, maybe it's internal users only enabled. And so you can say, okay, now all the employees of the company start to execute this code path and start to see this feature. And so, okay, great. That shook loose some bugs. Now let's push those to prod and fix them. Okay, now we feel confident that this is ready for some of our external users. Okay, let's turn that ramp up to now 1% of traffic. So now 1% of the traffic to my site is going to actually execute this code path and see this feature. And this is where this is one of two things where when you're on Facebook or Google or anything like that and you see a different screen for the same functionality than your friends do, what's either happening there is either a ramp up. So it's either about to go to 100% where everyone sees it, or they're doing A/B testing, which I'll get into in a second, which is at its most fundamental level, here's version A of a page, here's version B of a page, which one does better by some metric. So if you're an e-commerce company, which one gets people to buy more stuff? If you're a social network, which one gets people to click like more? But you're basically testing, hey, here's my two hypotheses. Let's see which one actually plays out, because it's not always the one that you think. So same with ramp ups. You ramp up, you say, okay, 1%, okay, now 10%. Oh, it turns out at 40%, it actually, a bunch of performance issues that were super subtle before actually really crept up now because of scale. Okay, let's ramp it back down, let's fix those, let's ramp it back up. The biggest takeaway from the security side on all of this is that this is all happening in production now, right? This is the big shift for us. This wasn't the testing that you did over 8 months or 18 months internally before this ever went live. This is all out there. And so just because it's ramped up to 1% of people doesn't mean that attackers can't find that. So this was my face on day one of hearing all this and starting in an environment like this, which is that this goes against everything that we've thought of historically in terms of AppSec. Right? This is, oh my God, what do you mean stuff goes to production not just every day, 30 times a day? Like, how can you ever keep up? How can you possibly code review that before that goes live? Ignoring the fact that you never really code reviewed everything before it went live under any other methodology anyway. And oh my God, this just sounds terrifying, right? Like everyone's pushing prod all the time. What do we do? So I've gone from that to now drinking the Kool-Aid and dispensing the Kool-Aid on stage, which is actually, I genuinely feel that this is a much more secure environment. I say that for really one fundamental reason, is that, and this is the thing that took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out, is that it's not so much the speed of your development that really influences the vulnerability count in your code base or anything like that. It's that vulns occur in every development methodology, right? Short of like formal proofs for control systems that are some embedded system like that. For any development philosophy, which we all really follow in this room, vulns occur in those. And so the biggest change under continuous deployment and why I think it's actually a security feature and not a security liability is that you can actually react. In the other ones, you don't really have that ability to react. There's no such thing as an out-of-band patch. How many people in this room have lived through out-of-band patches at your place of employment? Yeah, right? And it's terrifying because, okay, now page all of ops, page a whole bunch of dev, page QA. Great, now let's spend, at best, like 4 days rushing through this, emergency QAing it, rushing it out the door, and you know everything's going to break at the end of that. So you tack on 3 more days of like, okay, now additional update, point releases for that. And continuous deployment, it's just another deployment, right? It's no longer that scary out-of-band patch. You're already deploying 30 times every day, right? And so what happens is when an issue comes in, and this was the keyword on Former there was like, okay, great, well, we reported a security issue to a vendor of ours, and they're like, okay, we will drop everything, we will rush an emergency fix, and it will get out in 6 weeks. And this wasn't like a fundamental architectural change. This was XSS in the search box. Like this was a one-line change, and it took them 6 weeks of their release cycle, and that was them under like complete panic mode. They're like, we'll push up our 6-month release cycle to 6 weeks for this. So what makes continuous deployment safe in all of this, and I very deliberately say safe instead of secure, is that the nice thing is that what makes continuous deployment safe is really from a whole lot of other angles as well. And security gets to latch onto this. Like security doesn't have to drive all this change, which is completely amazing. So what makes continuous deployment safe is it's a little dark on there, but the instrumentation and the monitoring and the continuous level of instrumentation and graphing and monitoring and metrics out of this, right? If you're an e-commerce site again, and you just push to production, and the money graph just goes to 0 from how many checkouts are happening, you know something just went wrong, right? You don't have to wait for customers to write in and say, hey, I can't buy items on your site. That graph just went to 0. Right? And so the same way, I think that there's a really strong parallel to that's even darker. That's a plane. So I think that there's a really strong parallel to aviation in this regard of you can push to production without any of these graphs. Just like you can fly without any of these without any of the instruments or anything like that. It's just landing becomes pretty difficult, right? In the same way here, you can push to prod. You just don't know if you broke everything or not. So I think that same culture that is inherent to what you need out of continuous deployment and out of a fast release cycle, you get to use that for security. You don't actually have to be the crazy driver of that and say, no, 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 trust us, we need graphs. Everyone else already says, okay, we need graphs to do this. And you're like, great, security needs graphs too. And the biggest lesson learned out of that was really not just building things for the little security bubble that a lot of security organizations tend to live in, it's surfacing it for the entire organization. The key is, if you can notice on here, the key is include some grumpy cat, and it's too dark to see, but some lens flare right up here. And with those, you get a lot of buy-in. The key out of this is not so much the graph itself as where you put this graph in your organization. This is no longer the, okay, this is on like a laptop near me in my one area. This is up on a TV along with, you know, all of these other graphs that are going on here. Right, surfacing this because the thing that you're going for on this, and Nick Galbraith says this really well, is that don't treat security as a binary event. I think the thing the trap that we end up falling into as most organizations is seeing like security as one of two states. Either everything's fine, or we're on the front page of the Washington Post, right? And we're either owned or we're not owned. And so surfacing the million states in between there is, I think, one of the most critical things you can do, whether that's on the AppSec side or the NetSec side or anything like that. From the security side, surfacing that to the rest of the organization is fundamentally critical, because what happens is when what you're going for is a shift from abstract to concrete. You're going for this thought of, okay, if I'm writing code, if I'm a web developer at an organization, and I'm writing code, I know what's going on the internet. I know people are going to attack it abstractly. I know I need to be worried about things like I've heard of cross-site scripting and SQL injection, all this sort of stuff. It's very different when you're walking by to grab coffee and you're seeing a spike on a graph that's an order of magnitude more than you've ever seen. And you're like, what's that? What is that? And you're like, oh, that's people looking for SQL injection in their app right now. You shift from that abstract knowledge to very concrete, measurable things. You can say, oh, okay, no, I get it now, right? Like this stuff is actually happening. So how do you build the culture that kind of embodies it? I'm sad that the mullet doesn't come through quite well there, but it's fantastic. The way in which we shift to continuous deployment is by removing all of those blockers, right? You'd have a 6-week development cycle or a 6-month development cycle, let's say 6 months, then you'd have 2 months to 3 months of QA, then you'd have maybe the couple weeks of security and maybe some other testing, and then it would go live, and then stuff would break, and then you would ping the developers from that again, and they're like, that was 8 months ago. I have no idea what that code even does. And you rinse and repeat. The key here is that when we're removing all of those blockers, and it's no longer that huge cycle, and you're writing code and you're shipping it to prod, if security tries to function in the same way of being like, oh, we're the blocker, where's your security sign-off? It doesn't matter. You get routed around, right? If I'm a developer and I can commit and push to prod, and I'm a just random developer, and security shows up and it's like, oh no, that's gonna need a security review, and we're busy, and that'll be like 4 weeks. Like, cool, no problem. I'll come back to that total. Oops, it's on prod, surprise, right? Because you get routed around. If you become the blocker in the organization, then you are the bureaucracy that gets routed around. So what we need to focus on, and this is really a shift in the way that we've done security for a decade, is that you now need to incentivize people to reach out to you. Right? It's no longer the, oh, you got to go get the security checkbox before it goes to prod. Now it just goes to prod. And did you talk to security? Maybe, maybe not. And it was kind of up to you. So what were the hard lessons learned out of that? The first one seems incredibly dumb, but there is a reason why it's the first bullet up here. It's that the moment you, as a security team, when someone comes to you with an issue, or even they don't come to you with an issue, you find a vulnerability and you go to some development group and you're like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. You see where you call eval on the Git parameter? Like that is what? The moment that you do that, you not only lose that individual developer, you lose all of their peers, right? Because the moment that people feel stupid talking to you and that you're a jerk, they're just not talking to you anymore. And the worst part of that is it fails silently. Like you don't know that you lost that group. You're super busy anyway. You don't even realize that they haven't talked to you in like 8 months. And you're like, oh, weird. And it's kind of strange. Last time I talked to them, I made fun of them, and they haven't come back. It's really, really strange. The other side is being able to actually make trade-offs. I think this is something that we historically do a really bad job at. As security, we tend to view it as, I love how Alex Stamos put this, as security nihilism, right? If we can't do everything, there's no point in anything. And that we found 10 vulns in this block of code, all 10 have to be fixed before it goes to prod because security. And the reality is a million shades of gray in between. And being able to make realistic trade-offs on that and be able to say, like, okay, here's 10 issues in your code. Here's the 2 that actually matter. Like, here's the 2 that are going to get us owned right away because not only are they trivial to find, they're trivial to exploit. So here's why it matters, and here's the trade I'm willing to make. If you guys can get to these 2, then these other 8, if you can get to those in the next few weeks after you ship, that's a fair enough trade to me. And here's why I think that's a fair trade, because these other ones, maybe they're easy to find, but they're difficult to exploit, or they're easy to exploit but difficult to find, or hopefully difficult on both sides. But you're able to make that trade-off, and you're demonstrating that it's not, the moment that you find security issues, you're not going to become a blocker about all of them. You're going to make actual trade-offs. The other side of that is being able to really explain why. So not just because insert security term of the day here, right? Oh, this needs to be fixed because that's improper input validation. You're like, cool, that doesn't actually tell me anything, right? That doesn't tell me, if I'm a developer, that doesn't tell me like, okay, why do I care? Yeah, that sounds bad because it's improper invalidation, but why do I actually care, right? Being able to walk through and be like, okay, of those 10, here's the 2 that matter, here's why. This one, when you put in something like this is all the user data that you're able to get out of it. So maybe in some cases this means like demonstrating an exploit for something. Usually it doesn't actually mean that. Usually it just means not lapsing into security jargon and saying like, okay, here's what this actually means. This is how you exploit it. This is what you get. This is why it's easy. And then dumb culture stuff of just like rewarding communication. If you're trying to change behavior, how do you change behavior? You reward good behavior out of this. And what was hilarious and dumb to us was just like the simple things that are really effective out of this. So we made a bunch of like security team t-shirts, and we would give them out to bug bounty participants and things like that. But internally, we would give them out if you did something awesome for security. So whether that was just come ask us a question about, hey, I'm working on this feature. I know I'm supposed to protect user data. Should I be doing hashing or encryption? Like, awesome. Here's a t-shirt, and now let's sit down and walk through this. We also did the same thing with gift cards as well. Like, hey, you came and talked to us about an issue. It didn't even have to be your own issue. It was something, hey, I came across this in the code base. This feels really weird. Do you guys mind taking a look at it? Like, awesome. Here's a gift card internally. Because you actually get the reverse out of this of the first bullet, where when you're a jerk, you not only lose them, you lose all their peers. It's the reverse with this. You not only get them, you get all their peers too, because they go back to their desk with your new t-shirt or a gift card or anything like that, and they're like, sweet, security just gave me a gift card, we're just talking about some line of code over there. They're like, oh, cool, well, I've written a bunch of bugs, I'll go talk to them about that. Like, that's cool, I'm gonna get a ton of gift cards. The most controversial one, I think, and this really depends on organizational size, is taking the false positive hit yourself. And I think that this is something we've also historically done a really poor job of you get the magic security scan report, it's 10,000 pages, and you hit forward on that to the lead developer of some group and you say, security, like fix that. The problem is, the first time you do that, people probably take it seriously, and they're like, okay, great, here's this report, oh my god, 10,000 issues. Great, let me start working through these. And you get through the first 50, and every single one of them has been a false positive, and you're like, cool, now I know what the issue is here. The issue is I'm not flagging every email from that security person as spam, right? That's the way you actually solve that problem as a rational organization. So as a security team, taking the false positive hit yourself. Now, why I say this is controversial is what it feels like the trade-off is, and I don't think this is actually the trade-off. It feels like you're trading time for value, in a sense. Because let's say your security team is, a few people and your development organization is much bigger. And you're saying, okay, well, if we have to go through all these scan reports and everything like that before we send it on, that may take us weeks versus if we just send it to them, they're going to get to it right away. The problem is the underlying assumption there is totally wrong, that they're going to get to it right away, that they're not spam filtering all that stuff after the third time you sent them a completely crap report. So taking that hit yourself, actually, I don't think really is a trade-off. Why I said that really gets controversial is as your organization scales, you have to do this a bit differently, right? As you go from hundreds of developers to thousands to tens of thousands, this starts to become, okay, well, how do we really take the false positive hit ourselves when our development organization is 20,000 people? The way in which you actually scale on that is, and the way typically people do, is you have kind of a central security team that sets policy, then you have embedded teams at kind of the individual business unit or vertical level, and then you have individual teams, usually even at that point, in the individual product level. And so you actually can scale with that by embedding teams at other organizations. That's a whole nother talk in and of itself. How you scale effectively kind of in between there is you go via your team leads. So the situation which you're trying to avoid is that it doesn't matter how fast you're hiring security people, you're hiring other engineering folks faster, right? So even though, let's say you start and you do a great job of convincing your organization that they should be talking to security, 6 months from now, your organization is different, is wildly different. And so the way in which we found this to be effective is going via the team leads. So going and building relationships with the different team leads. Now, I say leads, that doesn't mean the team manager, that doesn't mean the technical lead of that team. It could be just the loudest developer on that team. It could be whoever is kind of the influential figure of that team. Because what you're going for there is when a new engineer joins that team and goes to do something in production, whether they're shipping code or they're making a production change on some system, and the influential person of that team says, cool, what's security have to say about it? And their first reaction is probably a fairly rational one of like, why would you ever talk to those guys? And then the team goes back and says, no, we do here. So go bounce it off them. They're not going to block you. And go bounce it off them and then come back and let us know what they say. You never had to have that training conversation with that new developer. Somebody else did it for you. And so you're able to scale that way. Okay, so second section of the talk, really the kind of DevOps side of things. So it's, up front, it's very simple access control in startups. There is none. And startups, you should really air quote here because this is actually like most organizations. The thing is, as you grow or as different things happen, you're going to have pressure, whether that's regulatory, whether that's compliance, whether that's just you were a group of 5 people and now you're a group of 500 and not everyone should have access to the production database anymore. The biggest lesson learned out of this is don't take away capabilities, take away access. So I'm going to give a methodology for this and then I'm going to give like a specific example of this. So the key is figure out what the capability is, like what's needed and why. So it's not just people just SSHing to production web systems. They're not doing it just because they're bored. They're doing it to get their job done. So figuring out what they're actually doing that for is the first step. This is the big like all-encompassing step is go build an alternate method for that. Right now, this may take you 6 hours. This may take you 6 years, depending on what it is. But you go build the way in which it's actually safe. You transition the organization over from the unsafe to the safe, and then you this is where it gets a bit fuzzy, either you alert on the old unsafe way, or you shut off access or things like that. So the example I've seen over and over and over at different organizations is SSH access to prod. One of the most common reasons why it's done is, you need to go debug something. You got some report from customer support or something like that. There's no real repro steps in it, but there was some info where you could go like grab the error log off of the production web and start to debug that way at least. What's the approach to that? Okay, from security's freaked out because everyone has access to prod, but the development organization needs to do this to be able to do their job. So the way in which you think about it is, okay, well, what you actually need access to are the logs. You don't need access to production. So building that alternate approach of, okay, let's syslog it to a central box. That central box is either Elasticsearch or Splunk or whatever, tail and grep. Then you publicize that tool and you say, okay, look, this is how you need to do this is what you needed to get your job done before. Here's an even more efficient way, hopefully, to go get that. And now you get it for like all boxes. You don't have to SSH into one of 100 prods. Now you can actually just get it from the central source. And then this is where you can start to fail. This is where you can start to fail softly at first. So you could start this bullet. I didn't want to put like 18 on a slide, but this actually becomes like 5 different ones. And you can say, okay, first, alert. Just alert on anyone accessing prod. Okay, now people have really transitioned over. So access, alert on anyone who's not supposed to be doing it. Okay, now let's roll out 2-factor, but still allow access. Okay, now at this point, like the organization has changed enough where we don't even need to allow access anymore. And so you can kind of soft degrade rather than just, Elasticsearch and Kibana are live. Next day, access to prod is gone, right? Like that you end up taking away capabilities at that point because people aren't used to the new approach. Okay, final section, and finally a corgi slide. It's taken us way too long to get to one. Specifically on bug bounties and then on attack simulations and pen testing. So does anyone in here run like a public bug bounty or is involved in a public bug bounty program? Sweet, so yeah. So you've last slept a couple years ago, right? So they're tremendously useful, and I really believe this. They're tremendously useful with a few caveats, and I'm happy to talk with you after in more depth on this. The caveat is don't just rush into it because everyone's doing it. Like you're making very realistic trade-offs here, and you need to understand what you're getting into. But once you do that, they're incredibly useful. The two most common concerns I've heard from talking with organizations working on launching theirs are either budgetary or risk. So budgetary, the funny thing is almost no one who's involved in a bounty program is primarily motivated by money. They might be somewhat motivated by money because no one's going to turn down money. But you see this over and over and over again in your interaction with your different researchers that write in, is that what they want is Hall of Fame. They don't really care about, they'll take the money, but even if you're like, sorry, there's no money for this bug, they're like, great, give me Hall of Fame. Or if you even just say like, no, sorry, this isn't going on our Hall of Fame, they're like, please, but I tried. Like Hall of Fame is what they want. And then risk of inviting attacks, this one's kind of hilarious in one sense is that like, you're already on the internet. Like, right, the quote that I love here is like, you're on the internet, you already get a free pen test, you just don't get the report, now you do. Right? And so the big goals out of the bug bounties are really three things. It's incentivizing people to report issues to you in the first place. This may seem a little crazy if you haven't really spent time on offense, but there's a fundamental fear on the security researcher and the offensive side. So that was all my background before Etsy and everything. And even in 2014, it's still in the mind of different offensive folks finding bugs. It's 50-50 if you're going to get sued if you report an issue. Right? If you report the safest way as a vulnerability researcher or as any sort of offensive researcher, if I find a bug in company X, my safest way to do it is just to throw it up on Pastebin anonymously and like let them deal with the consequences. It'll get fixed, but you're not going to get sued. And that's a really scary, that's always been a very scary thing, and that's what the whole responsible disclosure debates came out of and what bug bounties came out of after that. Is that this is a very explicit promise from organizations saying, we are not going to sue you if you play by these rules and you send it to us rather than just sending it immediately to the New York Times. The other, and this is really for your security program, is how do you start to drive up the cost of vulnerability discovery and exploitation? And the ways in which you really do that are obviously on vulnerability discovery, you're hoping that you've got more people looking, that's trending down the number of bugs, so hopefully it's more difficult to find bugs. For some classes that's true, for some that's kind of not. But then driving up cost of exploitation, the way in which you do that is you get better as an organization responding. Right, your first time, and I'm jumping ahead a couple slides here, but the first time that you have bug reports come in, you're running around with your hair on fire, figuring out like, okay, what's the best way to respond to all this? By 6 months in, you're like, cool, another one, it's live, the fix is live, we're good. And then really providing the feedback loop of where you're doing well and where you're not. This one's huge. Because you can build all the metrics that you want internally of, oh, look, we've got this vulnerability class trending down over time, and we've got all these reports that say we're doing a good job here. The internet has a way of disagreeing with your internal metrics. So seeing what actually comes in, that's the biggest thing. Getting this outside feedback loop in the same way that you do with pen testing a lot of times, is seeing like, okay, well, we did a bunch of stuff here. Let's see how that actually fared. What you want to think about before you launch one is recording what vulnerability classes you expect to see and what you don't. So like, hey, we think we do a good job of SQL injection, pretty good job of stored XSS, an okay job of reflected, and a crappy job of DOM XSS. Then see what happens when issues actually come in. Do they line up with what your expectations are? Because that's your feedback loop of saying, oh, we thought we did a good job of this, but a ton of issues just came in. Actually, we need to start approaching this in a more systemic way. It's more systemic than we thought. Let's go back and really change our approach here. The two metrics that you want out of this, and I talked about this, is your number of bugs and their severities. These are the things you want to trend down over time. And then same with time to remediation. So the first time comes in, you as an organization, you just haven't had to respond to as many of these. You get better and better and better at this over time. And so you want that time if the same bug came in on day 1 of your bounty program and at day 1 plus 8 months, the time it takes to respond to that should be dramatically lower. Here's a key lesson learned. Let everyone know, not just your engineering teams on this, let everyone know that you're about to launch a bug bounty team, especially the ones that are not even technical teams, like your customer support team. Letting them know that everyone is about to be attacked. And the interesting thing for us was that attacks start almost immediately. For us, we didn't do a super publicized launch. We did, a couple of us mentioned it on Twitter, and then we did a small blog post about it. This was not like a big news event. This was, we just were like, all right, cool, we're live, and tweeted it 13 minutes before the graphs went off the charts. So the biggest takeaway out of these, and this was the one that I thought was really interesting, was that in pretty much every organization I've talked to, it's really your first 2 to 3 weeks. Like, ballpark it as your first month. I'm curious, like, did you guys see something similar on that? You see, like, first month? Yeah. So, like, first month is really where the most hectic time frame is. And at about a month out, the pace that is happening at that point is really the pace that's going to be going on until you republicize it or you, like, raise your vulnerability reward level or something like that. But those first 2-3 weeks are going to be intense. And the reason why I really mention that is know what you're getting into. So recognize that, okay, for those first couple, like 2-3 weeks, we really need to hit pause on a bunch of other projects, and we need to have people ready. Like, people need to be ready, not just our security team, but the rest of our engineering teams. And that's really where you give people heads up on that, say, like, look, issues are going to come in, and we're going to need them fixed even faster than we normally would, because as a bug bounty, your name gets made in your first couple weeks. It's going to be those first couple blog posts that come out that say, these guys were terrible to deal with, or they were great to deal with, and they responded instantly. And that's going back to that very first bullet point of the thing you're trying to do out of this is incentivize people to talk to you in the first place. And if all the blog posts come out and they say, hey, these guys were complete clowns to deal with, and they took 6 months to fix a simple issue and they never talked to me about it, then you lose that whole incentive and you lose the point of your bug bounty program. This one's unfortunately has to be vague, but think about the systems which you rely on as a security team and go make sure they're not running at 99% of capacity the day that you're launching a bug bounty program, because when they fail 3 hours in, hypothetically, it's really annoying. So go take a look at that. Like I said, money, the reason I brought this back up is that understanding when you have that interaction with your researchers, that their motivation is not going to be the money. That, like, that's usually what we started out with, of like, okay, are they going to argue with us about amounts and everything like that? And actually, I can get into this afterwards. But people arguing with you about amounts and things like that almost never happens, actually. We had it happen, well, twice. Once where that was in like a year and a half. Once was where the researcher didn't understand the issue that they had. They thought they had a much more severe issue than they did. And so they're like, why are you giving me almost nothing for this? And we're like, here's why. Here's the exact repro steps for your bug. Here's the write-up that you should have sent us for this bug. Here's what the actual impact is. And like, okay, get it. And then the other was just an extortion attempt. And so those are fun too. You can have that conversation over beers. And then the key to interaction and the way you make a good name is just frequent communication. This was, I mean, that sounds obvious, but let me give a specific example. It doesn't even have to be your response time to the issue. So they can write in and you can say, cool, got your stuff, we're investigating. Okay, we investigated, we confirmed. Okay, now we confirmed, but this is going to take us 6 months to fix. And that's kind of where you expect people to freak out and be like, 6 months, why can't you fix this immediately? That's actually not the thing. If you can give them a reasonable reason, like, hey, or you don't even have to give them that much of a reason. Be like, this is actually a much deeper issue than it looks. It's going to take us 6 months to fix, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to keep in contact with you throughout, and we're going to let you know if that deadline slips, and we're going to let you know what's up. And for those 6 months, once a month, you send them an email saying like, hey, this didn't fall off our radar. We're still working on this. Still looking like 6 months. That's the key. As long as if you don't just say upfront, oh, it looks like 6 months, and then you never write back, I guarantee they are going to set a calendar reminder for 6 months from there, go test it, and if it is not to the minute 6 months after, there's going to be a blog post going up of like, oh, they brushed me off, right? Okay, final section. And it's got tuxedos, so it's classy. So this is really a rethink of the way that we do pen testing. And the problem with pen testing is, how many people in this room are pen testers? Anyone? Okay, so I really feel that the problems with pen testing are very well understood from the offensive side and from the pen test side. And what I think it really boils down to, and I'm really speaking more on kind of the network pen test side at this point, is that that term has become so overloaded that your customers that are buying a pen test think they're getting one thing and you're delivering another. And that's not negative from either side. It's just that the terms have really gotten so confused. So at this point, what pen tests typically mean is what I think is more properly called vulnerability enumeration. You go enumerate a bunch of bugs, you write up a report, and you say, okay, here's your bugs, here's your high, mediums, lows, here's your steps to reproduce them, all of that. The problem is, and then the customer takes that and, well, in reality fixes almost none of them, but tells you they're going to go fix a bunch of them. And they start working their way through. The problem is that this is not how attackers actually operate against your environment, right? They don't go scan and go, okay, well, here's all my highs, and then I'm going to work my way through those, and then like start attacking my mediums and all that. In reality, the stuff that owns you up owns us up as organizations is usually half the time like a bunch of lows all chained together, or stuff that never even shows up in the report in the first place. So the way in which we should be thinking about running actual attack simulations is that you're looking to see how real attackers achieve your goals against your organization. It's not just showing, oh, look, compromise was possible. If you have an organization, compromise is possible, full stop. And what you're doing in the same way that bug bounties are really good feedback into your AppSec program of what's working, what's not, this is really good feedback into your NetSec program of really both what's working and what's not. Like, where did we thought we had really good detection mechanisms that did not work at all in practice? These complement everything else that you're doing of enumeration and compliance and all that fun stuff. But these are in addition to. These are not replacement of. So I tried to distill it down into 4 things that we learned running a bunch of these. First is make it goal-oriented. So obtain domain admin, read CEO's email, whatever. The key out of that one was asking your attack team for goals too. Don't just go to them and say, like, here's the 4 goals that we're worried about. Ask them what they would do if they were targeting an organization like you, because I guarantee they're going to come up with some that you didn't think of. That would have been just as damaging. This is by far the most controversial and toughest one up here, is full organization and scope. So I expect a couple chuckles under the breath of everyone from the offensive side, and from the defensive side, I expect a bunch of migraines to instantly appear because you probably want this too, and it's really tough. And what I mean by full organization and scope is that traditionally, pen tests are done with, okay, great, here's your 2x2. So here's your 2 people for 2 weeks. Here's your scope. You can target these development systems and this network, but don't touch anything over here, and definitely don't touch anything over here. Meanwhile, there's nothing more hilarious to your attackers than the concept of scope, right? Because they don't have any of that. They're like, oh, yeah, cool. No, I'll definitely go for your dev systems. Yeah, right, I'm on production, right? And so the keys in which we tried to mitigate risk out of this is how do you, because that's what you're worried about from the defensive side is, great, I understand the value of that, hopefully. How do I mitigate risk? Because I know with my luck, the first time I run one of these, someone's going to crash a prod DB, and I'm never going to get to run one of these again at best. So what we did on that is, like, for a specific case, like, okay, they had gotten to a point in our network where they were now, they could now hit like a production database, and they're like, cool, we've got an ODay for this, but it lands like 85% of the time. And if this was actually a real thing where we were attacking you, yeah, we'd throw that because we like those odds. But you know, the odds of actually testing, like Murphy's Law, it would crash this time. And so like, okay, cool. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to simulate as if you went forward with that step, but we're going to mitigate the risk of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a local account on that box as the MySQL user and give you SSH credits for that. So now you get to move forward to that box, but you didn't have to throw an exploit that might knock out a production DB, and you get to then move forward. And so how do you see, like, okay, and this is what you have to spend the time working ahead of time with your team and saying, like, okay, when you get to risky points like this, call someone either directly on the security team who is their contact, or as you start to have more fun, where the security team's actually in the dark about this testing, they call a cutout. And they call a cutout and say, hey, we're at this certain point, and that cutout says, okay, great, let me get you access to that, because the security team is trying to hunt you right now anyway, and if you told them where you were about to hit, they would then go focus on that. This is the whole basis, I should start this part earlier, this is the whole basis of like what attack sims actually are, which is realistic compromise patterns, how we're actually getting owned as organizations. That means if you want to simulate a client-side or a phishing campaign or anything like that, start them on a standard build of a laptop or a desktop. This whole concept of starting external or perimeter or anything like that is, if it was even true in the first place, it's certainly not true today. And then the whole concept of like, oh, O-days, like that was cheating. Like we have our IDS, but it couldn't detect that O-day. Like they're reality. That's not cheating at all. If they've got a shell, it's not cheating. And then finally, this is just kind of the logistics side, is typically these are done, like I mentioned before, like 2x2s, right? And then you get a status report at the end of the first week, and you get a deliverable at the end of the second week. In reality, it takes way less time to actually own organizations. So especially to achieve those different goals. So it's like, oh, my goal was to read the CEO's email. Yeah, I got that in like 36 hours, right? And so what you want to be thinking about on this is talking with your attack teams and saying, okay, as you hit goals, either do one of two things. Either then start again and go for a different goal, or start again going for that same goal in a different way, or start again for that same goal but with a different team. So maybe there's like 5 consultants that are lined up, but only 1 or 2 of them are operating at a time, and as they achieve a goal, swap another one in. Because what you're trying to get out of all of this is data. You want to get as much data, given that you're constricted by budget, that you can't run these sort of things all day, every day, forever. You only get a few of these a year, at best. Get as much data out of them as you possibly can. And what you want is not the, oh, there was a bug here, and there was a bug here, and there's a bug here. That doesn't matter. Bugs are actually really irrelevant. There's a controversial one to say. Bugs are actually irrelevant in this case of what you're really looking for is how do people move, right? And so much of lateral movement is compromising credentials at different points and then moving as your legitimate users actually do. And so what you're looking for is how and why did your attackers go from A to B to C to D? And just as importantly, what they didn't do. So you might have built a bunch of like really good detection stuff, and you're like, at this point in the network, you're like, haha, we are going to totally detect these guys. And then you may get an email like 3 days later, and you're like, oh man, they were super slow. Why haven't we detected them yet? And 3 days later, you get the email that like, cool, we're done. We got all of the stuff. But we had this great detection mechanism. Like, how did we not catch you there? And it turns out like, oh, well, maybe if you built a detection mechanism to see how people are doing network enumeration and figuring out your network, but you forgot that your internal wiki is totally unauthenticated, and your NetOps group posted all the network diagrams in that, totally unauthenticated, and your attacker, the first thing they did was go to the wiki and just look at the network diagrams and be like, I never need to run a single network enumeration thing in my life. I know exactly where every box is. Then they're not going to go trigger your different detection mechanisms. Cool. All right, final couple slides here. I'm totally over, so I'll get to like a question, and then I'll just hang out right after the talk, right out there, so if there's any questions. Like I said, you're really going for realistic attack behaviors and patterns and different profiles. So this is the other thing, is that your attackers are not all one and the same, both in skill level and in profiles. So their objectives may be smash and grab, get the database. They don't even care if you detect them and get out. It may be just maintain persistence to an organization for when you want to achieve different objectives later. You want to simulate both of those because what you're looking for is what signals overlap of those. Where are the detection points where it doesn't matter that their objective was just to maintain persistence or it was to smash and grab. At a certain point, they went through point C, and that's where you start building your detection mechanisms. So in conclusion, the way in which we adapt to DevOps and continuous deployment are surfacing security monitoring and metrics to the entire organization, not just to our security teams. You really need to shift from this thought of security being a blocker, because that's actually going away, and how do we incentivize teams to come talk to us? And then don't take away capabilities, take away access. And then finally, the way in which you start to really drive up attacker cost is through feedback loops of realistic data of how people are actually compromising our systems through bug bounties and through attack simulations. And so you're awesome. Thank you for coming. Saying that in a lot of organizations, you see a lot of network metrics up on TVs on the walls, but you don't see security. And one of those reasons might be from the legal perspective, that legal is worried about vulnerabilities and things like that. I can give you 2 answers. The first is don't tell legal. That one, the camera's still on, so don't go with that. That is not actual advice. The actual answer is that you don't need to be surfacing the detailed exploitation steps to be surfacing good info, right? You can surface a lot of info in aggregate of here's how people are looking for vulnerabilities and things like that, that I feel, I mean, I'm pretty far from a lawyer, but I feel like are the right trade-off of giving concrete info to folks without giving like, hey, here's brand new vulnerability X and here's how you exploit it, and anyone who walks by gets to see it, even if they're just a guest visiting for lunch. Right? I think that because I think that's a real concern. I think that's a very valid question, is that you still want the absolute details of your issues probably kept within the security team or shared kind of as needed, but that doesn't mean that all of the info, right? Like somebody looking for SQL injection and the exact payload that's going to dump out your users table are two different things. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right. I'm going to get off stage, but I will be right back there.
Why don't we thank Zane for a great talk?
Thank you.